You know it's Halloween. You know it's Halloween.
You better wake up. The world you live in is just a sugar-coated topping. There is another world beneath it. The real world.
Fear is one of these tools that demons have used historically.
When I was a kid, I could see things. Things humans aren't supposed to see. Things you shouldn't have to see.
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
This female demon, essentially, that fed on the blood of children and stole the virility of men.
Look, I know the supernatural is something that isn't supposed to happen, does it?
A vampire is nothing like a warlock. My granny could kill a warlock.
Oh, how do you know about vampires?
I read.
How do you know about vampires?
Because it's human nature to fear the unknown and what is poorly understood.
But tonight, we shall hurl the gauntlet of science into the frightful face of death itself.
Okay, Vampire Anatomy 101. Crosses and running water don't do dick, so forget what you've seen in the movies. You use a stake, silver, or sunlight.
Angels and demons can't cross over onto our plane. So instead, we get what I call half-breeds, living alongside us.
Even in death, the human body still remains active. Hair and fingernails continue to grow. New cells are produced, and the brain itself holds a small electrical charge that takes months to dissipate.
The dead are not quiet in Hill House.
That takes months to dissipate.
We don't abandon reason, but we also can't cherry pick what elements of supernaturalism we want.
Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, Damen und Herren, for what you are about to see next, we must enter quietly into the realm of genius. Genius.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural. Vampires, werewolves, and witches, creatures of the night. Born of folklore and fear, twisted through history into something much darker, much more seductive. They linger at the edges of human consciousness, defying the boundaries between myth and reality. Let's talk about vampires first. They've been everywhere in popular culture, iconic in their own way. From Dracula to Interview with the Vampire, even Twilight. They're charismatic, immortal, alluring. But underneath that exterior, they're still monsters, feeding off the lifeblood of the living. Historically, vampire lore originates in Eastern Europe, where reports of revenants, the dead, returning from the graves to attack the living, were common. People even feared that death wasn't the final escape, that the body could be corrupted, slaved, wander the earth. But there's more. We have vampire legends from all over the world, from Malaysia to Latin America. As if this primal fear of something feeding off our very life essence transcends time and place. Is it merely superstition, or are we dealing with something real? Next, there's the werewolf, the shapeshifter, the beast within.
You're acting like a pack of rabid dogs! And that, gentlemen, simply will not do. Not if you expect to defeat the vampires on their own ground.
From the Wolfman to modern depictions like Teen Wolf or Underworld, the werewolf represents something primal, something we try to bury deep inside. History shows us accounts of the berserkers like the Norse warriors said to channel animal spirits, becoming wolves or bears in battle. And then there are the darker cases, like Giles Garnier in the 16th century France, who was executed for lycanthropy. Was he a madman? Or a criminal? Did he fall victim to a kind of mass hysteria that painted him as something more than human? And lastly, we'll talk about the witches. Popular culture like The Craft or Hocus Pocus or even Charmed, to the more frightening of American Horror Story, witches have become icons in popular culture, rebelling against societal norms, women and men seeking power outside the structure of the church. Throughout history, witch trials targeted anyone who stepped out of the line, targeted those who may have questioned authority. Hundreds, mostly women, burned, drowned, hung. Why? Could it have been the very idea of a person wielding supernatural power outside the sanctioned boundaries terrified those in control, those who manipulated the masses through their religiosity? So what do we make of them? Vampires, werewolves, witches. Are they mirrors, reflecting parts of ourselves we don't want to face? Are they part of the shadow self? Are they brought on by our fear of death, of disease, of losing control? Or are they from our hunger for power, our hunger to control?
I think the point is to make us despair. To see ourselves as animal and ugly. To reject the possibility that God could love us.
As much as we try to rationalize, we're still haunted by the same monsters that plagued our ancestors. Maybe it's shadows in the night, maybe there are things out there, ancient, hidden, biding their time. They're not just archetypes, and they're not just stories. It seems there's something buried in our collective memory, something of a warning. But then again, if the truth is veiled and we start putting lights on it, it might not be as comforting as we'd like it to be. Today, we venture into the world of the supernatural, exploring the age-old legends that have haunted humanity for centuries. Vampires, werewolves, and witches. Are these mere figments of our imagination, or do they hold a darker, more tangible truth? Our returning guest is a distinguished scholar in ancient history and anthropology, whose work delves into the murky waters where history meets the supernatural. His insights promise to shed light on the origins and realities of these iconic creatures of the night. He is the ancient seeker, supernatural scholar, cryptic researcher, Dr. Jared Burton. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us today. I thought we would start our conversation if you could share your perspective on the historical and cultural insights of vampires, werewolves, and witches.
Certainly. Well, most people's exposure to those topics is in the venue of fiction. No deficit of interface with pop culture, literary, cinematic treatments of those topics. But the really interesting thing about those inspirations for those tales is that they are rooted in folklore and in culture, in some instances even in text, so that we have these cultural anchors on which to at least consider the possibility of their existence. That they because they're recorded either in oral form or written form, they represent experiences that people have. And even if some of those experiences are, let's say we write them off to, delusions or mental health issues or something of that sort, it only takes not even just a few, it only takes just one of those accounts to be true for consideration for the entirety of the supernatural elements at play here to be part of our reality, part of our experience. I think that in order to understand, look, I've told people in the past, to better understand something like the vampire, you have to strip away the plastic fangs and the cape and the cinematic and the literary veneer. Very much the same with the other topics for today. The fact of the matter is that humans have been writing about their experiences and telling tales about their experiences regarding these entities for millennia, for as long as humans have been on the planet. Really, the tipping point for me in beginning to better understand these entities really came through my introduction to doing really textual history. I had always thought that because of growing up as a child, I always thought that these tales were interesting, but I was even at that time trying to consider where something like this would fit in a biblical paradigm. And it occurred to me that entities like vampires and werewolves, and more pronounced covenantal practices like witchcraft, were aligned with the demonic. The tipping point for me where I began to, like I say, to take this stuff seriously was when I read a book that my parents had given me for Christmas one year about the historical Dracula. Excellent work by two historians, Raymond McNally and Radu Florescu, a book called Dracula, Prince of Many Faces, which was kind of a follow-up to another book they wrote called In Search of Dracula. But what occurred to me in reading this is that it was the first book that I actually paid attention to the footnotes, how exactly historians work and gather data. Yeah, they get into the documents, they learn the languages, they learn all of the methodological and research tools that they're going to need to accomplish their research aim, their research goal. And this was an interesting milieu for me to learn all this stuff in, because it exposed me to not only 15th century Romania, but also the folklore of Eastern Europe, the concept of folklore. It was a lush introduction to the Greek Orthodox Church and the Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Empire, because, of course, it's during that period that the last of the Byzantine Empire falls sway to the Ottoman Turks with the siege of Constantinople in 1453. In all fairness, this was largely a historical treatment about Vlad III, who was the Prince of Wallachia. But the authors are very responsible in the way that they portrayed Vlad, that he doesn't completely escape the attachments that most people have attributed Stoker giving to him. That even in his lifetime, he did things like the drinking of the blood of his enemies. That he couldn't completely escape concepts like supernatural concepts like the Sholomance, which was an occult school reputed to be in Romania that Vlad had allegedly studied at. Now, it's interesting that the history of Eastern Europe at the time is littered with references to this secret school, the Sholomance. It's an interesting question that's left up to me, but the point that I'm making is that this air of supernaturalism and demonic evil, even in the retelling of Vlad's history, Vlad Dracula, that is, you really can't. The deeper you delve into it, you really can't separate the two. But I became interested in not only early European modern history because of that. I also became more invested in studying things like vampires and werewolves and witches from a cross-cultural anthropological perspective at that point as well. And that's why I've proverbially worn the professional shoes of both historian and anthropologist, particularly when it comes to topics like vampires and werewolves and witches. But I've had a long-standing interest in all of those that, as I say, dates back to my upbringing, which was a Christian upbringing. Those are always set against the backdrop of faith, of if these things exist, then how is a person to look at them biblically? How is a person to look at them from a perspective of spiritual warfare? And it just so happens that the deeper you get into these subjects, the more you find that they fit into the various taxons, if you will, that the Bible gives us for these kinds of entities.
But this is one of the things that I thought we would look at is the transformation themes, right? If we look at the theme of transformation, which is pretty prevalent and popular in werewolf and vampire mythologies, because there's werewolves changing from man to wolf, and vampires from monster to bat, etc. And so how does the Bible address transformation?
It's interesting. There are a number of instances in the Bible that I think help illustrate that point. As to the vampire, of course, there are two explicitly vampiric entities that are articulated in Scripture. I'm thinking specifically of the Isaiah chapter 34 reference to Lilith, the Lilith, who was prolific in ancient Near Eastern belief and mythology, as this woman who, female demon, essentially, that fed on the blood of children and stole the virility of men. The other creature is the Aluka, which you find interestingly enough, in Proverbs, a book where you might not expect to find a reference to a creature like that. But the Aluka is usually translated as horse leech, but it's actually a kind of shape-shifting vampire creature in ancient Near Eastern lore. And I would, to your question, I would point people to the Aluka in particular, because of its implicit in it, because it's a shapeshifter, is this transformational quality that it has. But you also have, whether people want to call it an instance of boanthropy or werewolfism, you also have the transformation of Nebuchadnezzar that's referenced in the book of Daniel. The interesting thing about a person within Scripture, becoming possessed of a demon or demonized, whatever description you want to talk about it, is that they're oftentimes the precedent is some sort of behavior, or a kind of, the argument can be made that a sort of agreement or covenant is made so that can happen. And if you project that onto, let's say, the history of vampirism and werewolves, especially witchcraft, the covenant that is the making of a deal with this entity, whether explicit or implicit, is part of that transformational process. Now, it's better articulated in the history of witchcraft, and if people want to look into this, I would highly recommend Montague Summers' History of Witchcraft and Demonology. There are a ton of works out there. Guarzo's work, I think it's called The History of Witchcraft. Summers' book, The Geography of Witchcraft, is actually a really good study as well. But if you're really looking to get into the source material, just tear the bibliographies up in these books, because people like Summers in particular were just consummate scholars when it came to this kind of material. Most scholars within the last 50 years or so, whether they be historians or sociologists or anthropologists, don't give much credence to the supernatural being a realistic part of the story. But it's interesting that not only do you have the covenantal agreement that precedes someone becoming a witch, it's been very interesting to me to find that the witchcraft element is almost the glue that holds all of these transformational processes, not just in European tradition and European lore, but the world over. There does seem to be some sort of magical or alchemical process that a person has to go through in order to become a vampire, become a witch, or become a werewolf, or some other sort of creature. Werewolves very often, or were creatures in general, are very often associated with witches. Well, even in our own country here in the United States, the shape-shifting lore is almost universally attached to witchcraft, particularly in the American Southwest. But it's very true of native tradition all throughout the Americas. In fact, the skinwalkers of the Southwest very much associated with witchcraft. And by witch here, we're specifically talking about the anthropological definition of a witch, somebody that goes completely anathema against the moral, cultural norm of a society. That's really kind of the universal element of witchcraft. And of course, they seek to subjugate nature in order to use it to their own design or use it to their will. But getting back to the issue of werewolves and witchcraft, the study of European werewolfism gives you the same kind of fruit, particularly in France and Germany, where we have a lot of records that are actually coming out of not just the witch craze era of the 16th and 17th centuries, but the ensuing 18th and 19th centuries as well, also include lots of references to witchcraft. One element that's almost a universal in these European accounts from the time in question is that some sort of ointment or salve would be rubbed on the body, and spellcraft of some sort would be wrought in order to facilitate this transformation, usually along prescribed times, not infrequently associated with full moons and lunar cycles, that sort of thing. But yeah, you're hard pressed to find many places in the world where shape-shifting and blood-drinking demons or blood-drinking creatures aren't linked to some kind of witchcraft.
So outside of like the biblical text and into the medieval era, where writers like Montague Summers or Sir Scott and a handful of these others were writing and being prolific scholars with these ideas, what ended up happening was we have these Christian practices that developed, evolved, and changed through time, but they began in the Middle Ages on how to protect oneself from these. And so my curiosity is what is, first and foremost, what's the significance of the role of fear in these myths? How is that the primary, could that possibly be the primary drive for their continued fascination within our culture?
I think on one level it is, because it's human nature to fear the unknown and what is poorly understood. So there's an element to it, but there's also the supernatural consideration, of course, is that, again, taking our cues from Scripture, it's pretty clear that demons feed on fear. They're and even accounts going back all the way to the Dark Ages, basically. This is a constant in the recounting of experiences and contact with demons, demon possession, demonization. that sort of thing. So I think from the perspective of the demonic element, and I should point out that I think at the very root of each of these examples that we're talking about today, particularly the vampire and the werewolf, is that these are demonic entities at their root, and that they have the ability to manifest both physically and spiritually. That's why they're often described as preternatural, because they have both of those elements. The witch, of course, being a disciple or student of a demon. To your question, I think fear has been part of the engine that has perpetuated and kept these stories, not only the stories circulating, but from the perspective of the enemy, this is part of the strategy. A lot of people will be familiar with my work on the side of Paneas, Caesarea Philippi. I'm convinced at this point, and I've articulated in a number of places, that Pan is simply another face of these goat demons that go back, millennia into prehistory, all the way to arguably Azazel and the Genesis 6 Watcher incursion. And historically, these entities, particularly as we read about the Greek face of this entity, Pan, utilized fear as a weapon. That's, of course, we retain that in our word panic, which was one of the two afflictions that Pan could induce in people: panilepsy on the one hand, and panic on the other, which was an immobilizing kind of terror. So it seems to me that fear is one of the more utilized tools that the demonic realm has, and for each of these entities, the vampire, the werewolf, the witch, there's always that component of fear that's being utilized to manipulate somebody.
When we go from, say, biblical times and into the folklore, ideas of folklore and how they modify, change, and alter creatures that we might have experienced or might have read about in a biblical text. Take the Lidlutu demons and the Witch of Endor, for example. Folklore takes a hold of these and grabs them, and then it's in folklore that the modern pop culture takes them, right? So when we trace modern pop culture, they go back to the folklore myth. They don't go back specifically to a biblical text or a historic or prehistorical idea of an entity. And so how do you find the evolution of the vampire, the werewolf, or the witch as it's portrayed in modern pop culture as opposed to what we might have found in the biblical narrative?
In some ways, it does. It's a circuitous sort of route, as you pointed out. Something that I had never considered before I read Summers' first work on vampires, The Vampire's Kith and Kin, was that there was a tie to the vampiric entity that went all the way back to the pre-flood world, to the first incursion and the first generation of Nephilim. And it was Summers in one of the prefatory sections of the book that pointed to Enoch as an explanation for the vampire. And right there in that first section, the Book of the Watchers, their judgment, the judgment of the Nephilim, their sentence essentially is that they would wander the earth and be forever hungry and seeking flesh, but never be able to sate any of those fleshly desires. And Summers, I think, accurately linked those two together. So in some cases, we can point to texts like Enoch. We can point to epigraphs, inscriptions about these entities. But I take your meaning because it's only been until really within the last century, a few centuries, that literacy has become more widely available. And so it was natural for these huge repositories of oral tradition and folklore to grow out of that, because that's how they communicated. Most people weren't writing a lot of things down. It was just, if you had a priestly caste or aristocrats or whatever in your society, that was basically it. It was less than 1% of the population that could write and record this stuff down. And so you're right in pointing out that's been a big repository for recounting the stories of these kinds of entities. From an anthropological perspective, it's equally valuable in many ways to the textual references. And we inherit, getting to the pop culture, literary, cinematic element here. In a lot of ways, pop culture takes both those ancient textual connections and the oral tradition, the folklore, the myth, and cherry picks according to what the cultural supply and demand model is. And a lot of that is basically at the mercy of what sort of technological and artistic adaptations are possible at the moment. So if we're in the early 1900s, we're talking radio drama and silent film, that sort of thing. Now it's a lot different. You get a high budget movie with a CGI, that makes a lot of this stuff come to life. Artists and creators have typically followed that model. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been outside demonic influence to shape that. I think that's another thing to consider in that question is where do we see that, in our culture within the last 50 years. We've seen things like the vampire and the werewolf and even the witch not being the villain, but rather they become the hero or the anti-hero of a given story. I think that there are authors and movie makers that toe that line enough to make it interesting, but then there are some of those that just, it becomes outright, travesty and in some cases blasphemy. But I think the Twilight series was one of those that pushed the envelope too far, and then we're left with things like, all the series that are out now. A lot of people are quick to vilify Anne Rice because of the Vampire Chronicles. The thing I always thought was interesting about Anne Rice is that even though the vampires were the center of the story, whether it was someone like Louis in the first novel or his sort of mentor Lestat, they were sort of opposite end of the spectrum. Louis was constantly struggling between his humanity and his vampire nature, and Lestat had just in libertine fashion embraced the license of it all. But what all these vampires had in common was that most of them did embrace their nature, but they all had this self-loathing, that they acknowledged that they were monstrous, that their natures were not benevolent at heart, in other words. And that was something to me that always sort of carried through. So I think, now I'm not telling people to go out and read the Vampire Chronicles. I'm just saying that's really kind of the line, in my estimation, if you want to use a metric for, pop culture, where the scale started tipping, where more creators and writers and artists started saying, well, now it's time to make the vampire and the werewolf and the witch the heroes, because they've been vilified, for one reason or another throughout the ages. In a lot of ways, I think that's a sign of the times. It does belie the sort of demonic stratagem that's at work in the acceptance of the suaveness or coolness of vampires and werewolves and witches.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about how I watched the Kate Beckinsale Underworld series not too long ago, and was looking at how you have an actual interplay between werewolves are the bad guys, vampires are the bad guys, and vice versa, and the humans are just caught in the middle of the entire story of what's going on in this supernatural battle. But I was also thinking about how, for example, there's a shift, and in the vampire story from medieval individuals like Montague Summers, who records stone cages being put over the top of graves to prevent them from rising from the dead or being staked into their coffin, etc., to someone like John Polidori, who wrote a Vampire with a Y in the early 1800s, where he actually took the story of the vampire and instead of focusing on the entity, began working on how it affected the environment around itself, specifically what it targets, nature, behavior, mannerisms, etc. And then it evolved again with Bram Stoker's Dracula, which after looking at it maybe through the eyes of like an anti-Catholic Victorian era period, was more designed to take a creature from mythology, vampire, and explain Catholicism in heavy Protestant England and what it would look like, and how you don't really know who the enemy is because they can look just like any of us. And then changing again in the 30s with film, with Nosferatu, Bela Lugosi, etc. I think you're absolutely right that there's this cultural change where the culture changes and we start to accept bad guys because we find out that we might have more in common with them than we previously believed.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot there in terms of Jungian psychology. I certainly don't profess to be a strict Jungian. I think he articulated some interesting ideas. The shadow self being one of them. In a lot of ways, that's something that's kind of spelled out in scripture too. Our human nature it's corrupted, without the redeeming value of Christ, in it. It's not kept in proper check. It's something that we still wrestle with even after finding Christ, but we're in a place to mitigate, hopefully in a place to mitigate the shadow self. And so I think, you flip that around, it's the complete opposite when it comes to the applications in pop culture and cinema and art, things like that. He's edgy. He's always going to be cool. He's always got that cool factor. Even in Stoker's novel, Dracula has the Victorian era version of that. In a lot of the same way that one of my forebears, Sir Richard Francis Burton, one of the things he did was translate the Kama Sutra into English, which was a huge scandal in the Victorian era. But it was still, for the Victorian audience, it was still sort of that eyebrow raising, can't look away, kind of revelation, as was a lot of the stuff that he translated, which was from places, exotic places in the East, like India and the Sind and Persia and the Middle East. The Arabian Nights was one of the things that he translated. So there's a story that Stoker used his image, his very foreboding visage, as part of an inspiration for the way he described Dracula in the novel. So there's that shock value of the rogue, the villain, that seems to capture the imagination. That's certainly not something that's confined to Western tradition. You find it, in oral and literary traditions all over the world. And that speaks to, I think, the psychological element that you're talking about here. Yeah, there's a human psychology at work here, but there's also a kind of a screw tape letter, C.S. Lewis, demonic psychology that's at work here too. And of course, for these entities, they've been studying this stuff for millennia, so they know how to weaponize it. And I think it's happening in mass today. It's always been there, but it's just that it's more accessible now, and the demand for it makes the production of it, a seamless thing, a near seamless thing anyway, because we're consuming it not in movie screens and theaters so much anymore, but on our tablets and TVs, through streaming service. So it's sort of in your face, and you can't really look away at it, even after the initial shock may wear off. As a footnote to that, this is something I think that's good that we can take from Stoker's novel, is that in a lot of ways it's kind of one of the first pieces of quote unquote Christian horror, because the implements of faith are used against it. And you mentioned the sort of the Victorian standoffishness, High Church of England standoffishness of Roman Catholicism. But isn't it interesting that you've got these different elements of Christianity sort of working together? Van Helsing, who's coming from a Catholic background, you've got most of your English players who are Church of England, and then you've got this guy from Texas who's probably Baptist or Methodist or something like that. So you've got this scope of denominations working together to fight this greater battle. And I think that's such an important message even for our time today. Not compromising ecumenicism in a cross religious mode, but the kind that should draw all people who profess Christ under the same banner, in the way that Sabine Baring-Gould, the author of the Book of Werewolves, wrote the hymn "Onward Christian Soldiers." I don't remember him delineating between Orthodox and Catholic and Anglican and Baptist and Methodist. It's a banner that we all flock under. And so I always thought that was a really neat, really valuable lesson to come out of Stoker's novel.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, if we were to look at the fallout, what happens in cultures as they begin to deal with the outside, deal with the other or the external or the unknown, and things start happening. I mean, for example, we can take the Salem witch trials, and a lot of evidence points to that there was probably ergot poisoning going around from bad bread kind of thing. And so these people are hallucinating insane things.
Sure. Yeah, and you've got the sociological, legal sorts of considerations too. Yeah.
And it leads to these moral panics. And so my question is, besides the tried and talked about a lot Salem witch trials, what other kind of moral panics did we see in history relating to these three?
Well, there's the idea that whenever you have the equivalent of a vampire outbreak or sightings of werewolves or that sort of thing, there's the idea that this is somehow divine judgment, that it's a scourge because of a community whose morality has fallen or something like that, that generate this sort of panic. The witch craze in Europe, which preceded the era of the Salem witch trials, basically from the end of the 1500s through the mid 1600s, there were a profusion of witchcraft cases that stretched really the entire continent. There wasn't really much of Europe that was left out of it. Particularly Germany and France, probably secondarily the British Isles, and then Southern and Eastern Europe also had their own facets of the witch craze. At issue here is you may have certain things like you did in Salem, with grain going bad and the ergot poisoning. The tendency is to think of Europe during the 1500s and 1600s as monolithically Christian, which it wasn't. It was largely Christian, but there were still, even in the 1500s, there were still parts of Eastern and far Northern Europe who were still practicing some form of traditional paganism. And even in other parts of Europe, much of it survived in rural areas in the form of what scholars call hearth religions. People might keep trinkets of old gods that have been passed down, in the family, and they may not even know why. They're just these family heirlooms, and typically, whatever, rites that they might practice that they may not remember, exactly why they do. It might have to do with the weather or the growing of crops or the tending of herds or what have you. A lot of that was done at the fireplace, hence the name hearth religion. It's where Germanic and Old English words like heathen come from, which mean pagan. Even in a metropolitan setting in the cities of Europe at the time, these kinds of syncretisms existed. And if people are interested, there are two authors that I would point them to. Carla Ginsburg is one, who wrote a number of great works like The Cheese and the Worms, and a book about the Benedante, who are one of these syncretistic groups that existed into that period. Gosh, I can't remember the guy's first name. Levi-Brühl is another one. Guido Ruggiero in particular, I guess that's three authors. Guido Ruggiero's book, The Binding Passions, talks a lot about this. Practices like making a wax dolly or effigy, which is clearly, it's imitative magic that's borrowed from, these older practices in Europe. But this lady puts it in a church next to an altar, ostensibly to absorb some sort of power, and so you have this syncretism going on. This was the atmosphere out of which the witch craze began, as Europe became organizationally, politically, and religiously more Christian, whatever form that took, whether it was Roman Catholicism or Orthodoxy in the East, or the Protestant denominations that were beginning to flourish. You really see these two worlds collide. Certainly they had been by that time, over 1,000 years, but it's really at this point in the early modern period that these things really come to a head. And again, I'm the first person to say that there probably was genuine demonic activity during this time too, but it wasn't monolithically so, because there are cases that they speak to things like women not having access to the legal system at that time, and then seeking means of adjudication outside of the law. So there are a number of things at play here. The supernatural is definitely one of them, but you have to account for the sociological, anthropological elements of the story as well. And so you mix all this stuff together, and you've got a situation that is both caused by fear and generates its own fear. And again, as I say, the same can be said for the profusion of vampire accounts that we have in Central and Eastern Europe from the 17th and especially going into the 18th century. Which is, I've always thought, is one of the great ironies of that period, that at a time when the Enlightenment age is breaking out onto the European intellectual scene, and empiricism is supposed to stamp out all of this superstition, it gives people the observational tools to record, the accounts of these experiences, so that the legal accounting, of instances of vampirism and werewolfism and witches and things of that sort, that stuff is documented by army officers and army surgeons and magistrates and lawyers and all kinds of officials. The written word lends an air of panic as well, and a twist, if you will. One thing we have to remember is that fear is one of these tools that demons have used historically, and they certainly weaponize them in these situations.
Absolutely. As we work on landing the plane, I'm going to ask the real big banger of a question here.
Okay.
This is a big one. It's involved a little bit. How has the blending of Christian and pagan beliefs shaped the modern interpretation myths of vampires, werewolves, witches, and how do contemporary Christian communities address these myths? Specifically, in what ways do these myths intersect with beliefs about the devil, supernatural phenomena, and how have, say, Christian scholars or other global faith communities worked debunking or reinterpreting them with stuff like scientific explanations and personal faith experience, which has influenced a lot of people's understandings of these myths. Finally, what might the future hold in terms of how these myths will be understood and reinterpreted in future generations?
You weren't kidding. That is a banger of a question. Well, on one level, we're bombarded with this stuff. I mean, you can't turn on your phone without getting an advertisement for the latest vampire movie or vampire series or werewolf or witchcraft. Take your pick. Any occult topic has been turned into something that's digestible for mass audiences, and so we're really kind of saturated with it. And I think that makes it difficult for communicating the supernatural reality, the supernatural evil that's very real at play here. And you mix that with the influences of things like materialism and naturalism that have crept their way into churches, for over a century now. And it becomes easy to peripheralize the reality of the supernatural reality of something like a vampire or a werewolf, or even the practice of witchcraft, because outside of our pop culture interface, it's just not typically part of somebody's everyday experience. And so that on the surface makes it immediately easier to marginalize, to say that it's not theologically relevant, that it's how in the world is it going to affect me. Vampires, come on, you got to be kidding, right? Fangs and capes. Part of the challenge is stripping away the pop culture, literary, cinematic veneer that all of these things have amassed in recent years, in recent decades. I think that there are scholars within the last 20, 25 years who have been doing work toward this. Biblical scholars, historians, linguists, who are pointing people to the material so that they can begin to think about this stuff for themselves. As well, how would we run into these things in the Bible, like the Aluka and the Lilith, and the Bible from one end to the other is filled with all kinds of demonic entities and demonic practices and references to the gods of the nations. So there's this taxonomy of this stuff. I think that the late Dr. Mike Heiser, with books like The Unseen Realm, really began to articulate this stuff. And there are those of us that are that continue that legacy, pointing people towards the very real notion that these demonic entities have been around for millennia. They're the heirs apparent of the knowledge that the Watchers brought with them to the world. They're able to utilize that, and so whatever the form or the behavior that they choose to manifest in shouldn't be limited, in other words, by our own exposure to not just pop culture, but also to things like naturalism and materialism. I think getting people, and that's what these scholars have done and continue to do, is getting people to consider what's possible, what supernatural evil can do, and presenting the biblical framework, the biblical structure, the scriptural structure, the historical structure to make that more digestible. With, let's say, just Old Testament scripture, you have to get into the mindset of these people, and they didn't necessarily think the way that we do. They were inordinately more mythologically minded, and they believed in the reality of other gods and entities and demons and things like that. In the case of the Hebrews, they believed that Yahweh was superior. We don't abandon reason, but we also can't cherry pick what elements of supernaturalism we want.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, I had gone to see a movie recently. Despicable Me came out, 400 or whatever we're at now. And there was a trailer for a new movie coming. It was called Wicked. It's going to be the story about how the Wicked Witch of the West became her, and how Glinda, the Good Witch of the North, became her. After seeing the trailer, and after having our conversation here, what I'm watching unfold as I replay the trailer I saw in my mind is not really the development of a character into evil, but a sociopath being created going to school. It's kind of an interesting idea that the Wicked Witch of the West wasn't so much evil as sociopathic. It's basically a witchcraft-infused Mean Girls movie. And I'm just thinking that's exactly how it is that culture changes. It changes the way one would perceive, which means, it would change the way one perceives the Wicked Witch of the West when one watches Wizard of Oz again. We basically just have a teenage girl suffering some angst, and now she's a sociopath. Well, as we wrap up, is there some links and things that people can find, follow, and get more of Dr. Judd Burton?
Sure. You can go to burtonbeyond.net. You'll find the Burton Beyond stuff, and the Institute of Biblical Anthropology is there as well. People can take coursework. I teach coursework on these topics: vampires, werewolves, witches, ghouls, revenants, all kinds of things are part of the preternatural morphology. That is by far the most popular program. It's what Derek Gilbert has affectionately termed Monsters 101. But it's all looking at those kinds of things from the biblical perspective, the historical and cultural perspective. People can follow me on YouTube, Twitter, or X now, Facebook. I got a couple of projects in the works. The Serpent Mound book with Doug Van Dorn, and a forthcoming volume on Göbekli Tepe and the Bible with Dr. Aaron Judkins. If people are interested, they can email me at professorburton@yahoo.com. Always something new in the pike.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Dr. Burton. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the dark.